At 0500 local time, the air over Crimea was quiet. Runways were dark. Radar crews followed routine screens. Nothing suggested that this morning would be different from hundreds before it. Then 6 small Ukrainian drones lifted off, moving south along separate paths, spaced apart, silent, unremarkable at first glance. This was not a mass attack. It was a calculation. Their destination was an airbase housing some of Russia's rarest aircraft, including the aging but irreplaceable Beriev Be-12. Aircraft no factory is ready to replace. What followed was not chaos nor brute force. It was timing, terrain, and decision-making under pressure. The question is not what was hit that morning. It is how the rules of air defense quietly began to bend. The first test came almost immediately when Russian radar screens lit up with 6 separate contacts moving toward Crimea from different directions. This was not a swarm flying shoulder to shoulder, and it was not a rush for speed. It was spacing, timing, and patience, arranged so that every decision made by the defenders would shape the next 30 seconds. The system waiting for them was Tor-M2, a short-range air defense platform built to protect bases, columns, and high-value assets from aircraft, helicopters, and cruise missiles. Tor-M2 is fast, precise, and deadly when used as intended. Its radar can track multiple targets, and its missiles are designed to strike small, agile objects. But like any weapon, it was built around assumptions, and those assumptions mattered that morning. 2 of the Beaver drones made those assumptions visible. They climbed higher than the others, flew clean paths, and gave off radar signatures that were easy to see and hard to ignore. From the perspective of a radar operator, these were the obvious threats, the kind every training manual teaches crews to engage first. They were loud in the electromagnetic sense, and they demanded attention. While those 2 drones drew the eyes of the radar and the focus of the fire control system, the other 4 behaved very differently. They stayed low, closer to the ground, where terrain and clutter complicate detection. They split into pairs and took separate vectors, not rushing forward, but slipping along paths that forced the system to keep adjusting. Each small change added a fraction of a second to the decision cycle. Tor-M2 was never designed to fail in this situation, yet it was not designed to think creatively either. The system works best when threats arrive in clear patterns, allowing the crew to assign missiles quickly and follow established rules. When targets behave as expected, reaction time stays short and outcomes remain predictable. That predictability is a strength in most battles. Here, predictability became a weakness. The radar crew had to choose which targets mattered most, and doctrine pushed them toward the ones that looked the most dangerous. Those choices were logical, professional, and correct by the book. They were also anticipated by the attackers. This is the core of the distraction play. The goal was not to overwhelm the system with numbers, but to guide it into doing exactly what it was trained to do. By presenting clear, noisy targets first, the attackers shaped the defenders' focus, narrowing attention at the exact moment when flexibility mattered most. Modern air defense relies on speed, but it also relies on prioritization. A Tor-M2 battery can engage several targets, yet it cannot treat every contact as equally urgent at the same time. When operators are forced to rank threats, they follow signals, altitude, speed, and radar clarity. The 2 high-flying drones checked every box. Meanwhile, the lower drones exploited the quiet space left behind. Their paths did not break rules or use exotic technology. They simply asked the system to do too many things at once, knowing that even advanced defenses have limits when decisions must be made in seconds. This was not a failure of Russian engineering. It was a lesson in how human decision-making interacts with automated systems under pressure. The Tor-M2 did exactly what it was built to do, and that made its behavior easier to predict for someone who had studied it carefully. In modern warfare, exploiting limits does not always mean breaking through with force. Sometimes it means narrowing the defender's view, guiding their attention, and letting procedure do the rest. The first layer of defense was not defeated by weakness, but by expectation. The 6 drones continued south, having passed the first gate not through stealth or luck, but through timing and control. The missiles were still coming, and danger had not passed. But the opening move had worked, and the next challenge would not be solved by distraction alone. But distraction alone does not defeat missiles. Physics had the next word. The moment the missiles left their launchers, the battle stopped being about tactics and became a contest with physics. This was the point where software rules, radar math, and gravity began to matter more than intent or courage. As the missiles closed in, the drones did something simple and sudden. They dropped hard, cutting altitude in seconds, trading height for survival while keeping just enough speed to stay stable. This move was not dramatic to watch, but it attacked a weakness that radar engineers have known about for decades. Air defense radar works best when targets sit cleanly against empty sky. At higher altitude, reflections are sharp, motion stands out, and tracking is reliable. Near the ground, that clarity disappears. Trees, buildings, vehicles, and even uneven terrain bounce radar energy back in every direction, creating what operators call ground clutter. Ground clutter is not a glitch. It is a natural result of electromagnetic waves hitting a crowded environment, and every air defense system must filter through it. Radars use software to separate moving objects from fixed ones, but that process becomes harder as speed, angle, and background noise combine. The missiles chasing the drones were optimized for a different fight. They were built to intercept aircraft and cruise missiles flying higher, faster, and cleaner. When the drones dove low, the seekers suddenly had to decide what mattered and what did not, all while closing distance at extreme speed. At that altitude, radar returns lose contrast. A drone no longer appears as a neat signal moving through open space. It becomes one reflection among many, mixed with metal roofs, wet ground, and small changes in elevation. The missile's computer must decide fast, and fast decisions leave little room for doubt. This is where limits appear. Missiles are programmed with safety rules that prevent wild behavior, including chasing targets they cannot clearly identify. When confidence drops below a certain level, the system does not gamble. It stops. In this case, that stop came in the form of self-destruction. Rather than risk flying blindly into the ground or toward unintended objects, the missiles triggered their own warheads at a safe distance. To the operator watching the screen, the targets did not explode. They vanished. It is important to pause here and be precise. This description reflects a plausible technical explanation based on known radar behavior, but it is not a confirmed step-by-step record from classified battle logs. Modern air defense data is tightly controlled, and public accounts rely on reconstruction, not raw telemetry. That uncertainty matters. It reminds us that this was not a magic trick or proof that missiles suddenly stopped working. It was an example of how systems designed for one environment can struggle when forced into another. The missiles did not fail because they were poorly built. They failed because they were doing exactly what they were told to do, which was to avoid uncertain targets near the ground. In that sense, the outcome was not an error. It was a feature working as designed. This is why the moment matters beyond this single engagement. As air defenses spread across the world, many are still tuned for threats defined decades ago. Drones changed the shape of the problem, not by overpowering defenses, but by stepping into spaces those defenses were never meant to cover well. What happened next was not a collapse of technology. It was a reminder that physics sets boundaries no line of code can fully escape. Radar waves behave the same whether the system costs millions or billions. The drones did not need stealth coatings or advanced jamming. They needed timing, altitude control, and an understanding of how sensors see the world. Against that, even fast missiles can hesitate. By the time the smoke faded, the drones were still moving south. They had survived one of the most dangerous moments of the mission, but survival alone was not enough. Staying hidden would matter even more in the minutes ahead. Surviving missiles was only half the problem. Seeing without being seen mattered just as much. After surviving the missile chase, the mission shifted from speed to precision, because staying alive now depended on where the drones flew, not how fast they moved. This phase was quieter, slower, and far more unforgiving, since a single mistake in altitude or direction could expose everything at once. Radar does not see the world evenly. No matter how advanced a system looks on paper, coverage is shaped by land, buildings, and the curve of the Earth. Hills block signals. Valleys bend them. Cities scatter reflections. In places like Crimea Peninsula, terrain is not flat or simple, and that complexity creates natural gaps. Ukrainian planners understood this before a single drone launched. They studied elevation maps, satellite images, and known radar positions, looking for places where coverage thinned or dropped away. This kind of preparation takes time, patience, and a willingness to trust maps more than instinct. The goal was not invisibility. It was predictability in a narrow space, flying through a corridor where detection was least likely for a short distance. These blind spots are not wide, and they are not forgiving. They exist only within certain height ranges and disappear if a drone climbs or sinks too much. The drones entered one of these gaps by holding a very specific altitude. Too low, and trees, buildings, and uneven ground would interfere with control and navigation. Too high, and radar would catch them immediately. The safe band was thin, measured in tens of meters, not hundreds. This kind of flight is stressful even in training. Wind changes, small GPS drift, or minor sensor error can push an aircraft out of the corridor. At night, with limited visual reference and constant threat pressure, there is no room for correction once a mistake begins. Radar shadows explain why this worked. When radar waves hit rising ground or uneven terrain, they cannot bend sharply enough to fill every space behind it. The result is an area where detection drops sharply, even though the system itself is operating normally. These shadows are not secrets, they are physics. Many modern defense networks accept this reality. They overlap systems, place sensors at different heights, and rely on layered coverage to reduce risk. Even so, gaps remain, especially in regions where geography limits placement options. What made this approach effective was not novelty. Armies have used terrain to hide movement for centuries. Infantry follows valleys. Tanks move along ridgelines. Aircraft once flew low to avoid radar. Drones are simply the newest tool applying the oldest rule. This is why calling it a trick misses the point. It was not clever because it was new. It was effective because it respected limits that cannot be engineered away. Radar can be improved, but land does not move. For several minutes, the drones flew through this invisible corridor. To defenders watching radar screens, contacts faded, reappeared, or failed to form at all. Nothing looked broken. Nothing looked jammed. The system was simply blind where it had always been blind. This phase of the mission demanded discipline. There was no dramatic maneuver, no sudden acceleration, and no last-second escape. Success depended on holding a steady path through a narrow window, trusting preparation over reaction. It also revealed a deeper truth about modern defense. Expensive systems promise coverage, but coverage is never absolute. Geography always votes, and it often votes against the defender. When the drones emerged from the blind spot, they had crossed more than ground. They had crossed a psychological line, proving that layered defenses can be navigated without breaking them. Yet the most dangerous part still waited ahead. Passing one gap did not mean safety. Another defense line was already watching. The second line of defense appeared just as the drones cleared the terrain gap, and this time the margin for error narrowed sharply. Ahead stood Buk M3, a system built for faster reactions and wider reach, designed to catch threats that slip past shorter-range defenses. Buk M3 works on a different rhythm. Its sensors cover more airspace, its missiles travel farther, and its response window closes faster. Where the first layer forced choices, this one punished hesitation. For the drones, this meant movement had to become aggressive, not careful. As the radar locked on, the drones changed behavior. Instead of hugging open ground, they angled toward large structures rising from the landscape, including industrial buildings that broke clean lines of sight. Concrete walls, metal frames, and sharp edges do not stop missiles, but they complicate tracking at speed. This was not a cinematic dodge. The drones did not weave wildly or accelerate away. They slipped along edges, passing close enough to obstacles that the missile's guidance faced split-second confusion. At high velocity, even small visual disruptions can matter. One drone did not make it. A missile detonated nearby, sending fragments across its flight path, and a single piece struck a critical surface. The aircraft lost stability, rolled, and fell into open ground below. There was no explosion in the sky, only a sudden absence where a signal had been moments earlier. That loss mattered. It showed the limits of the approach and stripped away any illusion of invincibility. Drone warfare does not erase risk. It redistributes it. Every flight trades cost for chance, and sometimes chance runs out. The remaining drones pressed on. They did not pause, circle, or slow down to assess damage. Continuing forward was the only option, because turning back would expose them longer to tracking and follow-on launches. Survival depended on momentum. Buk M3 had done what it was designed to do. It reacted quickly, extended coverage beyond the first layer, and forced a casualty. This was not a failure of defense. It was a reminder that layered systems exist for a reason. Yet even here, the system faced limits. Engagement windows shrink when targets fly close to obstacles, and decision cycles compress when multiple contacts cross paths near structures. Precision remains possible, but certainty fades. For defenders, this phase is exhausting. Operators must track fast-moving objects through cluttered environments while coordinating with other units and maintaining safety rules. Each second demands focus, and fatigue grows with every engagement. For attackers, the cost is emotional as well as technical. Watching one drone disappear means accepting loss without hesitation. There is no time to reflect, only time to continue the mission with fewer tools. This exchange highlighted the real price of drone operations. They are cheaper than aircraft, but not disposable in the human sense. Each loss represents planning, training, and trust placed into a machine that does not return. The drones that survived emerged beyond the book's immediate reach, scarred but functional. They had paid a price to move forward, and that price bought access to the final phase. At this point, the mission balanced on a thin edge. Enough drones remained to strike meaningful targets, but there was no room left for mistakes. Every system ahead would be closer, faster, and more lethal. What began as a calculated approach had turned into a race against tightening defenses. The next encounter would decide whether the losses endured so far had meaning, or whether the mission would end just short of its goal. What survived the defenses now faced the most dangerous moment of the mission. The final phase unfolded fast, because once the drones crossed the outer defenses, there was no reason to stay cautious. Inside the airbase perimeter, speed mattered more than stealth, and every remaining second carried weight. The drones dropped into steep attack paths, aiming directly at parked aircraft and support areas. This was not a search for targets. The routes had been planned in advance, and the aim points were fixed before launch. The goal was to strike assets that could not easily be replaced. At least one drone slammed into a Beriev Be-12, an aging maritime patrol plane that still plays a role in Russia's Black Sea operations. The B-12 is no longer in production, and every airframe still flying carries value far beyond its appearance. Losing one means losing years of maintenance effort and a capability that cannot be rebuilt quickly. Moments later, another drone hit a Mi-8 nearby. The impact itself was not the most damaging part. The explosion reached stored ammunition, and the base erupted in secondary blasts as rounds cooked off, sending fragments in all directions. These chain reactions matter. Air bases are dense environments where fuel, weapons, and equipment sit close together. A single strike can trigger damage well beyond the point of impact, especially when assets are parked and crews are unprepared. Ukraine later released video footage showing the attacks from the drone's onboard cameras. Independent analysts using open-source methods compared landmarks, layout, and terrain features, and many concluded the location was likely Kacha Air Base, near Sevastopol. While exact damage counts remained disputed, the imagery left little doubt that aircraft were hit. Kyiv claimed multiple aircraft were destroyed or disabled. Those statements cannot be fully verified in real time, yet satellite images and follow-up reports suggested real losses and visible burn marks across the base. Even partial damage can ground aircraft for long periods. The importance of the B-12 goes beyond numbers. It represents a shrinking pool of specialized platforms, and replacing its role would require reallocating newer aircraft or accepting reduced coverage. In a region like Crimea, where presence signals control, that gap matters. The psychological effect was immediate. A base thought to be protected by layered defenses had been penetrated, and valuable equipment had burned on the ground. For personnel stationed there, the message was clear. Distance from the front no longer guaranteed safety. This was not just about destruction, it was about exposure. The strike showed that air power, when parked and static, becomes vulnerable in ways traditional planning did not fully address. Hardened shelters, dispersal, and constant readiness suddenly looked less optional. From a broader view, the attack carried political weight. Crimea has symbolic importance, and every successful strike inside it challenges the idea of firm control. Even limited damage sends a signal that defenses are under pressure and that adaptation is required. For Ukraine, the operation served multiple purposes. It removed assets, forced changes in Russian behavior, and demonstrated reach. For Russia, it created new costs, both in repairs and in the need to tighten security across a wide area. What stands out is not the size of the drones or the explosives they carried. It is the effect they produced once defenses were crossed. Small platforms, guided carefully, achieved outcomes once reserved for larger and more expensive weapons. As the fires burned and smoke drifted across the runway, the immediate damage was clear to anyone watching. Aircraft were lost or damaged, ammunition was gone, and operations were disrupted. Yet the deeper impact would take longer to measure. The damage was visible. The lesson went much deeper. The lesson from that morning is simple and uncomfortable for Moscow. This was not about luck, and it was not about one weak unit making a mistake. It was about a modern battlefield exposing an old way of thinking. Cheap drones, guided by planning and timing, forced expensive systems to react instead of control. Layer by layer, Russian defenses did what they were designed to do, yet each response followed rules written for another era. That gap between doctrine and reality is where damage occurred. Russia is not weak, and its air defenses are not useless. The problem is that power built around large, rare platforms struggles when faced with small tools used in smart ways. Losing even one aircraft that cannot be replaced quickly creates pressure far beyond the blast site. It forces changes in posture, movement, and confidence. This was not a drone story. It was a warning. When low-cost weapons reveal the limits of billion-dollar systems, power does not vanish. It shifts. Control becomes harder to keep, and every static asset becomes a risk. In wars like this, the side that adapts faster gains the advantage, while the side that reacts late pays the price. If you value clear, honest analysis of modern warfare and the real pressure points shaping today's conflicts, subscribe to Military Force. We break down the battles that matter and explain why they change the balance long before the world notices.